The Surgeon General of the United States announced rather arrogantly in 1976, "We have turned the page on infectious diseases." This smug medical attitude suddenly disappeared in the 1980s, when our community was confronted with a totally new and mysterious emerging pandemic. Where did it come from? How did it start?
That disease, in this case a retrovirus, and here we have a slide, a schematic picture of the HIV virus. It's a core containing two strands of genetic material, RNA, encased in a membrane with two glycoproteins on the surface. The glycoprotein is crucial for allowing the virus to target certain cells. In the case of this virus, it targets the T4 cells in the body, which are the ones that regulate antibodies and are the regulators of the body's immune system. Well, once attached to the T4 cell, the RNA penetrates the host cell, and for a time it's inactive, even for years. There then occurs a trigger or detonator, which may be, this is a little speculative, an infection that activates the T4 cells. And then the RNA is converted into DNA that penetrates the chromosomes of the host cell and turns it into a factory for the reproduction of the virus and the killing of the cell. So the retrovirus is an absolute parasite. It takes over the controls of living T cells and turns them into factories to reproduce virus. And let's talk about what happens to the body in terms of symptoms. First, there's an incubation period of some 6 to 8 weeks, after which there occurs the primary infection. Symptoms at that stage, in the majority of cases, are flu-like. That is to say, fever, night sweats, muscular aches and pains, fatigue, swollen lymph nodes, headache, sore throat, sometimes diarrhea, sometimes a rash. Then the symptoms disappear after a few weeks, and in many cases there's a prolonged period that's entirely asymptomatic. This is a period of latency, which can last months and has been known to last even as long as 10 years or more, the time being entirely unpredictable. But during this period, the virus continues to multiply and destroy the cells of the immune system. Then there comes the period of active AIDS, when there are direct lesions caused by the retrovirus, carried in some cases to the brain. Sometimes there's neurological damage, known as AIDS dementia, or loss of motor control, memory, sometimes reasoning power. But the characteristic, as you know, of AIDS, different from most infections, is that it's not the symptoms that it causes itself, but rather its ability to give rise to opportunistic infections by switching off the body's immune system, making it vulnerable to an exotic variety of infections that the body is unable to fight. This is immunosuppression. Later in the disease, the victim experiences weight loss, lethargy, recurrent yeast infections, rashes or sores, fevers, and night sweats. Active AIDS develops when a patient has fewer, with HIV, than 200 T cells per microliter of blood. The normal count is 800 to 1,200. So from this point, the average untreated, and I stress untreated, AIDS patient has about 2 or 3 years to live. Death is usually caused by a whole array of opportunistic infections with names familiar to you, like candidiasis, pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, Kaposi's sarcoma, cytomegalovirus, cryptococcal meningitis, but above all, tuberculosis, which is the most important of the opportunistic infections of AIDS, and globally at least, the most common immediate cause of death. And note how well adapted the virus is to its ecological niche in the human population. It's a lethal disease, but one that avoids killing its host too quickly. A major evolutionary advantage begins with a lengthy asymptomatic latent period, as HIV, when it's contagious, but the infected patient almost certainly doesn't know that he or she harbors the virus in his or her body. And then full-blown AIDS can last for long years, while again, the patient remains infective. Well, what about transmission? Transmission can occur in a variety of ways. As you know, it's transmitted sexually. Everyone knows that. We need to remember there was a myth about AIDS in the outset in this country in the 80s that it was a gay plague, that it spread homosexually. And you all know about the moral majority and Reverend Jerry Falwell, who welcomed AIDS as God's sword to destroy homosexuality. Apart from blasphemy and the arrogance of the claim to know God's will, what's most striking about Falwell's comment is his complete ignorance of the facts of epidemiology. The virus is present in bodily fluids, blood, semen, vaginal secretions, breast milk. So one means is certainly sexual intercourse, especially intercourse involving an infected partner where there are lesions that allow the virus to penetrate the skin and enter the bloodstream. Hence, sex, heterosexual or homosexual, where there's a pre-existing venereal infection such as herpes, is particularly dangerous, or sex that causes abrasions such as anal intercourse. So the risk factor is not homosexuality, but promiscuity, by which I would define as sex outside the context of a loving relationship, whether heterosexual or homosexual. In Africa today, it has been established epidemiologically that multiple partner sex behaviors account for 2/3 of all new infections. But AIDS can be transmitted in other ways, despite what Jerry Falwell said. It can be transmitted through the blood by shared needles and syringes, for example. Needles that haven't been sterilized, but are shared. One thinks of injecting drug users. One can think also of patients in resource-poor health systems in which needles are scarce and not routinely sterilized. One can think also of unsafe blood supplies, blood that isn't screened and is supplied to people by people who are remunerated, thereby making every transfusion a risk for HIV transmission. Another factor, of course, is the sex industry, where the disease spreads rampantly among sex workers and their clients. And then there's vertical transmission, a real shock to Jerry Falwell. The disease can be transmitted transplacentally from mother to fetus, or from mother to infant via breast milk. This is one of the drivers of the present-day pandemic,
the beginning of the epidemic here was probably July 4th, 1976. To celebrate the bicentennial of our nation, New York City hosted the tall ships. Huge sailing ships came from all over the world, and there was a lot of international partying going on in the Big Apple. Retrospectively, studies revealed that the first American babies who were HIV positive were born in New York City a year later, 1977. Papa Doc had a brutal regime that ruled Haiti from 1957 to 1971 by means of violent death squads called the Tonton Macoute. Therefore, when the Belgian Congo and Africa became independent from Belgium in 1960, thousands of French-speaking professionals escaped their oppressive government by taking jobs in the Congo. In addition, to help solve his economic problems in Haiti, Papa Doc promoted his capital as a tourist attraction for gay men from North America and Germany. Haiti was not the only country linking the chain of infection back to the Belgian colonies in Africa. Anyhow, back to what we know for sure. Another background condition responsible for the rapid spread of AIDS are the tools of modern Western medicine: hypodermic needles, blood banking, and invasive surgical techniques. One of the first cases of recognized AIDS occurred in a Danish surgeon named Greta Rask, who had gone to work in the Congo in 1964. She worked for 3 years in a rural hospital that often had no surgical gloves, doing her surgery barehanded. She fell ill in 1976, eventually having to fly back to Denmark under emergency conditions, and died there in 1977. What do people do when they're living a life of harassment and persecution? They look for a place to go where they'll be accepted, cared for, and left alone. Thus, ghettos form even without state decree. After the war, people who were ostracized and harassed back in their hometowns began to seek the anonymity of big cities. A gay community sprang up in Greenwich Village in New York. Another developed as a summer vacation spot on Fire Island. In the 60s, it was illegal to serve openly gay men at a bar. Radical gay power and liberation was launched with the Stonewall Inn riot the last weekend of June 1969, when a gay bar was raided by the NYPD and drag queens fought back. However, the apogee of political success for gays was achieved not in New York, but in San Francisco. Harvey Milk was elected as a supervisor, the first openly gay elected official in the nation. In 1978, right in City Hall, Harvey Milk and the liberal mayor George Moscone were shot by another member of the Board of Supervisors, the anti-gay politician Dan White. Instantly, Harvey Milk became a martyr, galvanizing gay solidarity. By 1980, the then governor of California, Edmund Brown, declared the last week in June Gay Freedom Week. This is the week of Gay Freedom Day parades all over the world commemorating the Stonewall riot. As a result, San Francisco became a mecca for gay people who streamed there in great numbers. They were thrilled to come out of the closet and participate openly. Gay people started their own churches and choirs. As a result, local charities like the Red Cross were happy to exploit their civic mindedness. In 1980, 5 to 7% of the donated blood in San Francisco was given by gay men who did not know that they were HIV positive. Gay men in particular were accustomed to covert and anonymous expression of their sexuality, and participation in the bathhouse culture was more mainstream for them. Remember, many of these young men had been repressing and hiding their sexuality for most of their lives. And when society denies people healthy ways of expressing their sexuality, all kinds of strange things begin to happen. Many of the strange things that happen in the bathhouses are perfect methods of transmitting every kind of infection, especially hepatitis B, Giardia, Salmonella, and something brand new, HIV.
You wouldn't be able in the future to write the history of the late 20th and 21st centuries without devoting an ample space to the AIDS pandemic and its consequences. From the standpoint of the industrial world, Western Europe, North America, some people have a comforting illusion that the emergency's been controlled for a couple of reasons. One is the fact that the number of cases in the developed world has leveled off. And secondly, there's been the development of expensive drug cocktails that have reduced mortality significantly, with many patients experiencing the disease as a chronic illness. But we need to be very careful about complacency. And this gives you some idea of the dramatic inequality of the burden of HIV/AIDS, that it's enormously a burden in sub-Saharan Africa, which has more than half of the total number of AIDS people in the world. Swaziland and Botswana have the unhappy distinction of having the world's highest prevalence. And here you see the worst case scenario. 26% of people are infected with HIV, the highest levels ever recorded, as are 20% of pregnant women. Those are rates of prevalence that the Center for Disease Control once thought to be impossible. And life expectancy at birth dropped below 40 years in several countries in the region. South Africa has the sad record of possessing the largest HIV epidemic in the world in absolute numbers, not though per capita. Now, epidemiologically, it now seems that there are two great divergent patterns in this terrible epidemic. In the industrial world, it's primarily an affliction of high-risk groups, men who have sex with men, sex workers, injecting drug users. But there's a second and more devastating pattern, clearly evident in southern Africa, where HIV/AIDS is a leading cause of death, and where transmission among high-risk groups certainly occurs, but it's overwhelmed by transmission in the general population. Their transmission is primarily through heterosexual sex, and significantly, more women are infected than men. And it's also true, as I've said, that transmission occurs on a large scale, vertically from mother to unborn child, so that significant numbers of children are born with congenital AIDS. Now, why women? Women in part because of biology. The disease is more easily transmitted from men to women than vice versa. Sexual inequality also fuels the sex industry, as does the epidemic is primed also by violence against women, and often the inability of women in many situations to negotiate safe sex practices. In many parts of the world, girls are simply severely discriminated against in terms of education, and therefore do not acquire sex education and knowledge necessary to take effective measures to protect themselves and control their reproduction. Girls who have not received primary school education are twice as likely to be infected with HIV as those with higher educational attainments. And as I said, violence against women is a major factor in the epidemic. It's also true that we need to mention cultural norms in these areas where notions of masculinity are important determinants of male behavior patterns that increase the risk of AIDS. The idea that it's meritorious to have multiple partners and unmanly to use condoms. there's a clear link with poverty. The countries with uncontrolled epidemics are among the poorest nations in the world, and poverty is directly linked with the epidemiology of HIV/AIDS. Poverty prevents national governments from building effective public health structures or educational infrastructures. And studies of sectors most at risk from the epidemic in southern Africa, that is, sexually active young people in the 15 to 25 age group, those studies reveal that large numbers of people of that age group still do not have an accurate understanding of the mechanisms of AIDS transmission. Local studies also show in some places that disturbingly large numbers of sexually active young people, 25% have been discovered in places, still have no idea of what a condom is. Poverty prevents people from having access to means to defend themselves, education, medical care, and treatment for those already infected. It drives recruitment into the sex industry, another major driver of the pandemic. It leads to unemployment, demoralization, and alienation, all of which fuel high-risk behavior, including intravenous drug use. And that, in turn, leads to further unsafe sex practices. Then there's the social and economic impact, which is maximized by the age profile of the victims themselves, that is, young men and women in the prime of life, who should be the mainstays of families and their economies. It's no coincidence that southern Africa, where the pandemic is rampant, is also rapidly urbanizing, and that indeed 20% of the global burden of HIV/AIDS falls on 15 cities in southern Africa. The movement of troops, once again, has proved to be ideal for sexually transmitted diseases and for prostitution. And the spread of other STDs, syphilis, gonorrhea, and herpes, actually furthers the spread of AIDS. The lesions that they cause, like genital ulcers, provide ideal portals for entry of HIV into the body. Trade and modern means of transport have been important. One can't understand the AIDS epidemic without roads, railroads, the airplane. Societal neglect is a theme we've talked about. And national governments, in some cases, nations that are poor and underdeveloped and have virtual status as almost failed states, have been incapable of taking major initiatives on their own in terms of improving the health of their populations. But in some cases, they also have other priorities. There's the siren song of military spending. There's corruption. Or let's take the case of the former president of South Africa, Mbeki, who refused to take science seriously and rejected the idea that the HIV virus causes AIDS. He called on people not to use condoms, but simply to drink a mixture of olive oil and garlic as a prophylactic of choice. So there's been a current of AIDS dissidents who reject the link between the virus and the disease. Fortunately, that situation has changed. Then there's stigmatization, which is a cause of the spread of the epidemic. It causes people at risk not to seek medical attention, and that in turn undermines surveillance and active understanding of the epidemiology of the disease. And the inequality of women who are stigmatized has a number of structural consequences, that is, in terms of inheritance laws, that disenfranchise them, unequal jobs in the economy, violence, early sexual debut, and large spread practices of what UNAIDS calls transactional sex. In Kenya, for example, teenage girls are 3 times more likely to be infected with HIV than boys of the same age. And the differential, instead of decreasing, increases with age. There is also the displacement of people. And HIV/AIDS thrives on migrant labor, on disrupted families, on refugee status, and in industries where migrants live, for example, among minors, in compounds at vast distances from their homes and families, a situation that leads to the thriving of commercial sex. Mobile populations are at high risk of infection. And then one of the vicious factors of HIV/AIDS is the burden of the disease itself, which causes the burden of poverty to increase, and poverty furthers the epidemic. So AIDS then leads to a vicious downward spiral in which poverty creates favorable conditions for AIDS, AIDS breeds poverty, and so on. And then there is superinfection, that is, multiple infections with different strains of AIDS. And one of the most tragic factors of all is the phenomenon of AIDS orphans. The WHO reports staggering numbers of them. It terms it a crisis of gargantuan proportions. Already in sub-Saharan Africa, 11 million children under 15 are orphans. Well, what are the effects of this dreadful pandemic on societies? Clearly, no one would be able to write the history of the present moment in southern Africa without giving a central place to HIV/AIDS. HIV/AIDS prevents education and literacy. Poor families with a member ill from AIDS can't afford to send children to school. The fact that it destroys healthcare systems, it destroys productivity, and creates a crippling burden of disease, destroys families and communities, thereby trapping whole countries in underdevelopment and international dependency. It destroys civil society and undermines democracy. It's a substratum for a lethal epidemic that follows in its wake, the reemergence of tuberculosis, the classic opportunistic infection complicating HIV/AIDS. It's a major cultural impact on societies. There's a demographic impact. We've already seen the way in which HIV/AIDS is altering the age structure of whole populations and transforming life expectancy. And there's even the possibility of failed states as a direct result of disease, with enormous implications for security, political stability, and democracy. But this last fact, paradoxically, has also opened a ray of hope. The realization that I last mentioned affected the national security estimate of our own government, which reckoned that in fact HIV/AIDS was a major threat to the security of the United States. The first time that disease was recognized by the CIA and the security community as a threat to our country. And the result of this realization that we are indeed a global community, and that what's happening in southern Africa and other places is of enormous impact throughout the world, led to a massive investment of funds. So one of the hopeful signs in the AIDS pandemic is that the campaign has become more sophisticated and focused. It has been realized that strategies that fit one phase in the history of the epidemic may not be effective at another stage. And so the response has continually to be updated and adapted. The priority now is to clearly identify high-burden areas as a priority and to saturate them with prevention efforts. Another lesson, that the commitment cannot be short-term, that it must be sustained, that short-term interventions that are then scaled back can be useless and counterproductive. There are also new strategies. One is the need to abolish the distinction in this pandemic between prevention and treatment as a false dichotomy, because treatment with antiretroviral therapy is in fact a valid and essential preventive strategy. In particular, antiretroviral therapy radically lowers the incidence of vertical transmission from mother to child. It's also true that antiretroviral treatment lowers the viral load and therefore reduces transmission. Antiretroviral therapy is a prophylactic because it prolongs the life of parents, thereby decreasing the number of orphans and vulnerable children, the very people who fuel the sex industry and are most likely to indulge in unsafe sex practices because they lack education, resources, and access to medical care.
When we think back over the course of the last 35 years or so of HIV infection and AIDS as a modern-day plague and the toll it has taken, it is a remarkable story of progress, but a story of unfinished progress, where the gains we've made are incomplete, fragile, and indeed reversible. During the late 80s and early 90s, when the world was discovering the enormity of the challenge ahead in tackling what became then known as HIV and AIDS, there was really nothing in place for humanity to get ahead of this epidemic. A number of institutional innovations, the formation of my own organization, UNAIDS, subsequently the formation of the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis and malaria, the United States announcement of the President's emergency plan for AIDS relief, really showed how seriously the world was taking the challenge of tackling HIV and AIDS. And while we've lost almost 36 million people to HIV/AIDS over that period, and today we have 37 million people living with HIV and AIDS, it could have been much worse. In Africa in the early 90s, to be infected with HIV was an imminent death sentence. Now, it isn't an imminent death sentence if you're lucky enough to have access to the antiretroviral treatments that you need. And if you do have access to that treatment, you live a life as long as someone living without HIV. And that's quite remarkable. Today, we calculate around 21 million people of the 37 million people living with HIV have access to that treatment. So that's great progress. And if you think, we just came from an event where we talked a little bit about South Africa. In 2000, 90 people were accessing treatment. Today, 4.1 million people are accessing treatment. So when you look at that trajectory, it's quite astonishing. And yet there are still around 17 million people that need treatment that don't get it. So the job is far from finished, is incomplete, and needs a redoubling of our efforts to get there. We're pretty clear what success looks like. In 2020, we know that success for us is less than 500,000 new infections and less than 500,000 deaths and zero stigma and discrimination. Because we can't say 20% stigma and discrimination is okay, right? You have to set that goal. Stigma and discrimination should not exist. We need to try and root it out of the system. Yes, we have. Our ambition is a world where we have zero deaths, zero infections, zero AIDS and zero HIV. Without a vaccine and a cure, that's difficult. not the AIDS part, but the HIV part, because there are 37 million people. If we have a vaccine, if we have a cure, then the zeros become realistic.